Anil's Ghost, Section 3 or Part 3 support video. First thing I wonder as a reader when I see a title like this is the title is A Brother. And you obviously can see my question, whose brother are we talking about? So that's the first question I wonder as a reader. We're talking about Anil's brother, Sarath's brother, a different character, Palipana's brother, who's no longer alive. These are things we don't know answers to right now, but I want to find out. So it's a question that should be going through your mind as you read. Okay, we're going to find out. And then the word A brother, which means one, like one brother. There's only one of them, okay? Or we're just talking about one of them. So not A, not the. It's kind of an unusual combination of words. Anyway, something to think about. Going on. So we know right away that we're in a setting change, okay? Here we have the operating rooms of the base hospitals in the North Central Province. There were always 4 books, and then they list these titles. We don't exactly, Michael Ondaatje, what he tends to do a lot of as a writer is just drop us in as readers. We just get dropped into these places. I kind of imagine like, in some ways when I read an Ondaatje book, every time I turn the page or start a new section, I feel like a paratrooper getting dropped out of an airplane, and I land somewhere and I hit the ground and I look around and I'm like, where am I? What's going on here? How does this connect to other stuff I know? And that kind of approach always helps me with an Ondaatje book, just to keep an open mind and just every time I turn a page or enter a new section, just be open to the fact that you might be somewhere new with different characters, and it may not be immediately apparent why you're there, but if you trust the story, if you trust the author, it all comes together. In this case, what we're learning about is we're learning about life in war hospitals. Why are we learning about this? Because this novel is dealing with a time of civil war in Sri Lanka, okay? And we're going to learn pretty quickly that we're going to be focusing on this Dr. Gamini. And if you've already read this chapter, you already know the answer to the question about whose brother this is. This is Sarath's brother. Gamini and Sarath are brothers, okay? And all that becomes apparent during this chapter. And we've actually met Gamini before. You might remember a time early on in the novel, Anil cut her thumb. She went to the hospital and she saw a man covered in blood sleeping in the waiting room, and then the nurses came out and woke him up, and she realized that was a doctor, and if she couldn't tell the doctors apart from the patients, she's like, why should I be here? But that was actually Gamini she saw there in that hospital. What? Yep, it's true. All right. So you can see the part that I've bracketed here. This part right here tells you some of the shocking developments in the Civil War and just the staggering rate of death and injury that was happening during this time and what the doctors were having to deal with. One thing Ondaatje does quite a bit is he'll change the point of view or the perspective. So the majority of this novel is in third person, omniscient perspective. Okay, but then we suddenly, for some reason, jump into second person. You can see the word I've circled right there. You were without self in those times, lost among the screaming. You held on to any kind of order. It's an unusual move for an author. For me, as a longtime reader, when I see something like that, what it does to me as a reader is it makes me empathize more. It draws me into the novel. It makes me feel like, oh, if I were there, that's how I would be feeling. Okay, that may or may not be Ondaatje's intent, but that's what it does to me as a reader. Okay, and I just ask that you, as an observant reader, pay attention to those things as well. Okay, this part right here, Gamini, you can see that I have Gamini circled twice on these 2 pages, and basically this is just kind of me doing the math as I'm reading, like, okay, this must be the brother that we're talking about. Okay. And this is essentially about Gamini and how the war and dealing with war trauma and war injuries changed him as a person. And and you can see this part that I've blocked. It shows that he stopped believing in man's rule on earth. He turns away from every person who stood up for war. These kind of principles about land, pride, ownership, personal rights. All those motives ended up somehow in the arms of careless power. which resulted in death. And so what he felt, that what he really believed in was the beauty of mothers caring for their children, and that the spirit and power of women and mothers. So interesting. Interesting development for him as a character. It's good background information for him. We, on the next page, on page 120, pivot away from Gamini to a similar story about a different doctor, a fellow named Linus Correa, okay, who was a neurosurgeon, a private doctor, who seemed to kind of skate above all the conflicts, but then is suddenly abducted. His bodyguard is shot, he's abducted, and he is forced to be a doctor for the people, for the insurgents, for the people rebelling against the government. One thing I want you to be wondering is, why this story? Why are we being given the story of Linus Correa? He will not be a major character in this novel, okay? But if you think about it, what's going on here? We start with learning about war trauma, doctors helping those who've been hurt in wartime. We learn about Gamini, and now we learn about Linus Correa. And what Ondaatje is setting up here is something called a foil, F-O-I-L. And foil characters are characters that reflect each other in some way. And so here we have two doctors, Gamini and Linus. Okay, both are working and serving people who have been hurt by war. Linus is forced to serve those who are insurgents fighting against the government. Gamini is on the other side, and he is serving the people who are hurt by the insurgents. So interesting parallel story. These two men are foils of each other. And I believe Ondaatje is setting these up to show essentially how similar the two sides are, how similar the experiences are, and also in some ways to put a human face on the insurgents. Okay. On the next page, 125, notice there's an asterisk there, so always pay attention to those. That's a transition. We notice right there what's happening is we're pivoting from Linus Correa right back to Gamini. Okay, and you can see their names, just two or three sentences apart right there with that asterisk separating them. Okay. On page 127, just want to point out that sometimes it's a little hard to tell what character, if its name has been specifically said. So just at the top of 127, the he refers to Linus. However, these paragraphs here are really about Gamini and Gamini's life. And, I want to point out that Gamini, he's become a drug addict of sorts. We don't know exactly what these pills are. They're probably some kind of caffeine energy pill of some sort. I don't know the right name of the drug that he's taking, but they're keeping him going so he can just work and work and work. And in many ways, he works to avoid the pain he feels in his heart from all the trauma he's experienced working as a medical doctor, but also in his own kind of relationships with other people, including his wife from whom he's divorced. This right here that I've bracketed is kind of talking about his age roughly. Gamini was 34, now he's roughly 36. He's working in a place called Accident Services. You might remember at the end of the last section, the Grove of Aesthetics, that Anil and Sarath were taking the man who'd been crucified to the road, had the nails driven through his hand. They were taking him to Accident Services. So what's happening here is the stories are converging, right? So Ondaatje as an author left us with Sarath and Anil and Gunasena on the road going to Accident Services. He leaves us there for a while, leaves us hanging, and he gives us all this backstory about the war and doctors, these two doctor stories. And now the things converge, the stories come together. And that's what happens here at the top of this next page, where Sarath and Anil arrive. Okay, we're like, oh, we're taking him to my brother. Oh, aha. So we have the confirmation that Gamini and Sarath are brothers. They have this kind of awkward interaction right here. And so for you as an observant reader, pay attention to this. How do we learn about characters? We learn about them by what they say, what others say about them, how they act, and how others act toward them. Okay, and what they think for the times an author lets us know their thoughts. So here we have this kind of awkward interaction, and it probably tells you all you need to know about that brother relationship. Here's some other information. Okay, kind of about the awkwardness between the two and the family story. What we get here is kind of on and off, kind of backstory. One thing that shocks Anil right here on this page, and this is the top of 132, is suddenly, Gamini out of the blue says, "Are you the team working on the new skeletons?" And then Anil, I've highlighted this, says, "How do you know about that?" She was suddenly tense, and that's a fair question. As far as she knows, only she and Sarath know about them. How does Gamini know about this? And of course, Gamini doesn't reply. He says, "It's the wrong time for unburials. They don't want results. They're fighting a war on two sides now, the government. They don't need more criticism. That's the government." And Sarath says, "I understand that." But notice that no one has actually replied directly to Anil yet. And Gamini says, "But does she? Just be careful. Nobody's perfect. Nobody was right. And too many people know about your investigation. There's always someone paying attention." So talking about that, this is like a building of tension in the novel that, Sarath and Anil thought they were working independently, but actually everybody seems to know what's going on. Okay? They're talking, and then suddenly Gamini just passes out. Just absolutely worn out. All right, transition here to a different section, and we suddenly go into this way backstory where we're learning about Anil's past, a marriage she had before the amygdala, that's that word right there. And I think a lot of these things, like her learning about her past, her development, is character development, all right? The top of 139, 138, earlier I was talking about the word you. When you see that, like who's talking? Here's Andache again saying, "We are full of anarchy, but if I meet a Sri Lankan somewhere," who's talking? Is this the author? It turns out it's actually Anil talking to Sarath. So this is dialogue right here, but it is disguised as just kind of regular prose. Okay. We then learn this about this kind of backstory about malefic, like certain women, according to Sri Lankan kind of custom and tradition, might be malefic, who people they marry, the husband will die or bad things will happen to them. In some ways, this foreshadows a bit of Anil and her relationships with others. Okay. However, she says these are not beliefs I hold, and then neither do I. She says we do this to ourselves. So Anil has no time for this kind of superstition. She thinks people cause these problems for themselves. So we have the marriage, and we learn about the husband she was married to, this kind of jealous sociopath, essentially. Top of 146, we have a transition. We're back to Colombo, so we jumped over to England in memory, and now we're back in Colombo. And then we're kind of learning about the work. We have a few pages left, and I'm going to stop this video and start another one. Hold on for part 2.